Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's LinkedIn Live event, in which we will shortly be previewing the upcoming summit between leaders of the UK and EU, which is being billed as a pivotal event in the resetting of post-Brexit relations. We'll be starting properly in a few moments' time at 12, but in the meantime, we'd love to hear from you. So please do introduce yourself, your business and sector in the comments. Let us know what you would most like to see happen in regards to the future of the UK-EU relationship, whether that's in terms of trade, mobility, defence, or any other areas. And please also do write in any questions you may have for our expert policy speakers today. This is going to be a largely policy-based conversation rather than going into the practicalities of doing UK-EU trade. So you may want to save your customs questions for our technical helpline, which I'll share more details about later on. I'll give you a few moments now, though, to write in who you are, what you'd most like to see from the summit, and any questions you may have. Great, let's get going. Good afternoon, everyone. Great to see so many of you with us on today's LinkedIn Live event, in which we are looking ahead to the UK-EU Reset Summit that is taking place on Monday, the 19th of May. My name is William Barnes-Graham, the Executive Editor at the Chartered Institute of Export and International Trade, and I will be your host today. For those of you who don't know about us, the Chartered Institute was established in 1935 with the mission of empowering global trade. We do this through advisory services, connecting your business with experts for bespoke strategic advice, by helping you build the trade leaders of tomorrow with training and qualifications in customs and international trade. And last but definitely not least, membership, offering exclusive events and resources to our members. In this session, we are, of course, previewing the summit taking place next week, looking ahead to what we think might happen in the context of the wider UK-EU relationship as we know it to date. Following the summit on Tuesday, the 20th of May, we will be hosting a member-exclusive session looking into the details of what is actually said and announced by British and European leaders during the gathering on Monday. We are indeed looking forward to welcoming Caroline Reid, the Deputy Ambassador in the UK mission to the EU, as a guest speaker at that event. So if you're a member, do definitely sign up to that session, and I believe a link is being posted into the chat. If you're not yet a member, well, why not join? This is an example of the exclusive access you can get to senior decision makers through the Chartered Institute at events both digital and in person. You also get access to our technical helpline to get expert advice on all your everyday customs and trade questions, opportunities to network with like-minded professionals via industry events and sector-specific special interest groups, exclusive access to expert-produced resources, articles and webinars, and so much more. You can go to export.org.uk/membership for more details or follow the QR code on screen. For those of you just joining now, we are really keen to hear from you throughout today's event. So please do type into the comments who you are and what business or sector you're from, any questions you may have about next week's summit, and any thoughts or opinions regarding what you'd most like to see from European and British leaders in terms of the future of the UK-EU relationship. I think that's enough introductory rambling from me, though. Let's get on to today's discussion. And it is my genuine delight to welcome our expert panelists today in Fergus McReynolds, the Director of EU and International Affairs at the Chartered Institute of Export and International Trade, and David Hennig, the Director of the UK Trade Policy Project at the European Centre for International Political Economy. These are two experts who truly know it all when it comes to trade, post-Brexit UK and EU trade relationships. And they've certainly been living at, or at least near, the heart of the matter when it comes to the months building up to this summit, both here in the UK and in Brussels. So great experts to have on today. And I believe both Fergus and David's LinkedIn profiles will shortly, hopefully, be shared in the comments as well. Fergus, if I could begin with yourself. I've mentioned now a couple of times, there's a big UK-EU summit taking place next week, and that's very much the reason we're here. So in very basic terms, what is this summit and why does it matter?
Thanks, Will, and hello to everyone who's joining us today. I think summits between countries or big trading partners are part of the wider foreign relations mechanisms of how the UK and the EU will discuss elements of the relationship and mutual benefit. It is a separate element of the construct of dialogue which is created through the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. It was something which was missing in the relationship historically, and something that business groups, including the Chartered Institute of Export and International Trade, called for as part of the reset that the new government that took office just under a year ago, to try and create the momentum to ensure that there was a alternative forum for leader to leader. And I think that that's really quite important here, is that summits aren't technical conversations. They're not conversations like the Joint Committee and the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. They are at a leader level. It will involve the Prime Minister and at least two of the presidents of the European Union, and the President of the Commission and the President of the Council. So it really is about setting the political direction. It gives an opportunity for those counterparts to meet and set political direction. It is part of the wider reset. It should also be noted that it's not a one-off. This is the first in a annual series of summits, which will take us through the totality of this government and the European Union's mandate of 5 years. So first in a series of at least 5, and one would hope that they would continue on an annual basis going forward as well.
You've mentioned the reset. Could you refresh delegates on why a reset is needed?
Look, I think it's important to reflect on a few things, and even 12 months ago, we would have said that the world had changed significantly from when the original agreement was struck. And in geopolitical and trade terms, hasn't the world changed even in the last 12 days, let alone 12 weeks or 12 months? So I think it's an opportunity to take a new look. The UK government took office, as I said, just under a year ago. There was also European elections, which coincided with that. So the new mandate for the Commission. And this is an opportunity really to take a fresh look at the relationship. The Labour government, or the Labour Party, in the run-up to the government, set out a number of key priorities in terms of achieving a greater strategic relationship with the EU. And this reset is part of that process. I think it's important to put this in context. The summit is not the culmination of the reset, as it were. The reset is an ongoing and iterative process which improves and leads to a greater strategic relationship between the UK and the EU. The summit is part of that series of annual events, and we may well get to it in discussions or even in questions later on. There is also the question of the review of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which is due to take place next year. And I think that is also a separate element. I think it's quite important to put all of these things in context. The reset is a longer program of creating the right strategic relationship. The summit is part of a annual event to give political direction to the two sides, and the review, I think it's fair to say that we don't know what the review will look like yet, but just to say this isn't part of that process.
We can come on to the review in a moment. I just want to bring David in. So I remember talking to you, David, just before you spoke at our conference last year, I believe, when Labour was relatively newer into government. And there's a view then that this reset was coming anyway for one form or another. I mean, how new is the desire to have another look at the UK-EU relationship, or is this a completely sort of new government, new mandate thing?
So, thank you, Will, and good to be joining you. Look, clearly a lot has been happening even in the last 6 months. So obviously we're talking about trade primarily on this call, but I don't think you can think about the summit without thinking about defense and security, which is actually likely to be the major area of deliverables. The election of President Trump clearly put a huge focus onto the UK-EU relationship and broader European relationships, particularly with regard to Ukraine. Expect outcomes in that area. I won't go any further into that. Then I think more broadly, the Labour government that was elected in July always wanted to just change the tone of relations as much as anything else with the EU. Although under Rishi Sunak, relations had improved, there's still a legacy from the Brexit years of a lot of discomfort, frankly, between the two sides, a lot of had words spoken by both, really, with regard to the other. You had the trade and cooperation agreement, which was broad but shallow, I would describe it. So an awful lot more that could be done there. And I think it was the view of incoming Labour ministers. This just needs to be on a whole lot of a better footing. This is the UK's most crucial relationship with the EU. We need to treat it as such. We need to be having regular dialogues. We need to be seeing where we can improve the relationship. We need, frankly, to see the EU as a way into some of the other, not a way in, but as a part of some of the other UK government aims, such as with regard to growth or irregular migration. And so, for all of those reasons, the reset was really important. Now, in the first 6 months of the Labour government, it was quite cautious. Activity has stepped up since then. But what I will say is that summits are a long time in preparation. So much of what we're seeing now, I suspect, is going to be dating back to discussions that were happening in January and February. And that's why it's important that there will be an ongoing process beyond this to carry on the dialogue, because some issues that some businesses have will be picked up by what's discussed and announced on Monday, but many will not be. And I think, there's a summit, then there is the continued work between the UK and the EU. This will go on. But I think in one sense, the reset has already been a success. We are having these dialogues. And just to get in a little bit of correction to Fergus, because I like to do this occasionally, there will in fact be 3 EU leaders at the summit, because the Foreign Representative Kai Kallas will be there, I believe, as well. I saw mention. So yes, 3 rather than 2.
Terrific. Well, good to get an extra EU leader in there. Dave, just to stick with you, I mean, obviously for the Labour government, the reset is pivotal in terms of the growth mission that it has, and the other things you mentioned as well around migration. From the European perspective, is it as important to the EU as it is to the UK, and what's in it for the EU? Well,
clearly, the EU is approximately 50% of UK trade, and the UK is 12 or 13% of EU trade. So clearly it is more important to the UK. But that 12 or 13% still makes the UK the second largest trading partner for the EU after the US. And obviously that relationship is a little bit questionable at the moment. Indeed, the UK-EU trade relationship is the world's second largest trade relationship. So the EU has the same challenges of growth through a net zero transition that the UK has, and potentially the UK can also be a part of the EU achieving its objectives. That being said, there's also the after effects of the divorce that happen in the EU as well, that are still quite keenly felt in Brussels and elsewhere. So there's a degree of caution to that. Yes, the UK is a pathway to improved European growth and security, but a lot of things happened, a lot of reasons not to trust the UK. And so for that reason, there has been an element of hesitancy on the EU side. And I think that will continue for a while.
Fergus, I mean, you're joining us from Brussels today, and I know you have a lot of meetings and interactions with EU negotiators and policymakers. So does that tally with your experience? Is there being a shift in that EU perception of the UK over the last few months?
Yeah, I think there has. I mean, and I think that David has really well set the scene in terms of, the percentages on either side are not as important as the actual fundamental relationship between the two. I think that's really important. The UK and the EU are important to each other. The relative size of trade between the two of them is going to be different on the basis that one has a significantly larger market than the other. I don't think we need to dwell on that. But it is a significant trading partner. It's also a partner which shares many of the same objectives in terms of long-term policy outcomes. It sits in the same place in the world. And right now, the geopolitical shift that we have seen, not least from Trump's tariffs, but also the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the resetting of the global security accord, and certainly the Western Security Accord, means that not just physically do the UK and the EU sit in the same place, geopolitically they sit in a very similar place. So I think there is equal merit in improving the relationship between the two. There will be some elements of the negotiations which will be higher priority for the UK, and some which will be higher priority for the EU. But I don't think you'll find anyone here in Brussels who's going to counter the overall hypothesis that improving the relationship in trading terms and in geopolitical and foreign cooperation between the UK is not a good thing.
We've touched a bit on what some of the things we might expect. So David mentioned a defence and security pact being amongst those. In reporting as well, going into this summit, there's been talk of mobility schemes, and certainly from the UK side, an SBS or veterinary, can never say that word, agreement of some sort. So, I mean, David, I could come to you first. Are those broadly the sorts of things we should be expecting? Is it going to be kind of this defence pact and a couple of other sort of pledges to do things? What sort of outcomes are we expecting?
Okay, so a couple of parts to that. First of all, in what form are we expecting this? We're not expecting a whole lot of new trade agreements between the UK and the EU. What we're rather expecting is some kind of heads of terms or common understanding, as a phrase being used, possibly even something called strategic partnership, which will lay out the areas in which the UK and the EU have broadly agreed that they are going to take forward, but that will be then subject to ongoing discussions. And those are a veterinary deal, as you say, potentially aligning UK regulations with those of the EU, as the EU and Switzerland already have. There will be a linkage of the emissions trading scheme, which should mean that UK and EU companies will be exempted from charges under the carbon border adjustment mechanism. There will be a youth mobility scheme. But between the two, there will be some mention of fish. Less sure whether there will be things on professional qualifications and touring artists, which the UK, which were in the Labour manifesto. And so the UK does want to make progress on those. There may be some mention there probably will be less advanced. Almost certainly, as Fergus had said about annual summits from here on in, there may be some other cooperation at political level. For example, there already is in areas like sanctions with regard to Russia. And then I think some more question marks. Well, where does the TCA review fit into the next year? What about some of the other issues that are not being taken forward? Some various issues that have been raised over time, for example, mutual recognition of conformity assessment. We're not expecting that to be taken forward at this point, but maybe they will be mentioned as areas that the UK and the EU may return to in the future. So it's a relatively substantial agenda, and the aim will be for talks on those elements to be concluded within a year or two, such that they can be implemented ahead of the next elections in both the EU and the UK.
Pretty comprehensive list. Fergus, I saw you unmuted. Anything you'd want to add to that?
No, I don't think so. I mean, other than I think the scene set, which I think is really important, as David has said, which is this isn't the conclusion of a negotiation and an announcement of a series of changes to the TCA. I think it's really important that the people's expectations are managed there in that way. Think of this more as a launch party for a series of very important and detailed work streams. This is a leader-to-leader summit. It's not a technical summit, which is going to talk about the real minutiae of the trading relationship or the wider cooperative strategic partnership, as David has mentioned. But let's not underestimate that. So while, yes, the sort of scope and the shape of the summit is known, let's think about it more as the start of the process, a series of work streams in these really important areas. For example, if there is a veterinary agreement or an SBS deal, that's going to take some time. It's a technical and difficult negotiation, which will take time. But let's not undervalue the political direction. I think examples that we used previously how important political direction from the leaders is in terms of getting progress on the technical detail. And I think back to the announcement that President von der Leyen made in Windsor a few years ago when announcing the Windsor Framework about the UK's accession to Horizon. That statement from the President of the Commission gave the space for the Commission services to start in earnest negotiating the UK's accession to the Horizon programme. So, it won't be a huge detailed change in the technical trading relationship, but let's not undervalue the importance of the political direction that both sides will give their teams to achieve more in the years to come.
That's a really good point. I kind of forgot about the Horizon thing. That was, forgive me if I'm wrong, was that a bit of a slip of tongue, or was it was very unexpected that she announced it? And then
no, it was linked. I just want to add one point actually, which is that with regard to Northern Ireland, we're not expecting any distinctive outcome for Northern Ireland, but alignment of food and drink rules between the UK and the EU will go a long way to reducing and potentially removing the barriers that we've seen between Great Britain and Northern Ireland to movements of food. So again, I'm struck by this, that one can look at this and say there's so many issues and so many will still be kind of unresolved after the summit. One could also look at this and say, real progress is being made. Perhaps we'd all like it to be happening an awful lot more quickly, but it is happening. There is real substance here. A couple of years ago, I don't think you would have seen this kind of level of progress. So sort of depends on where you're starting as to whether you think this is a good thing or not. Lots of people obviously want to go all the way, do this, do that. In reality of trade negotiations, of international relations, that's not really practical. This is going to be a big step forward in one sense, but a part of that ongoing process that Fergus keeps referring to correctly.
Thank you, David. Great. I think it's important as well to kind of have that context of saying, things are happening. This isn't just a sort of it isn't just for show, these summits. That things actually have happened in the last couple of years, as you say, with Horizon, with the Windsor Framework and so on. And plenty to come, hopefully. Just want to touch on, you both mentioned the sort of negotiation process which has been going on in the months leading up to this summit. And obviously, you're both very much involved in kind of discussing with people negotiating and people around the talks through your various lines of work. Fergus, maybe initially, could you say a bit about kind of what the process has looked like over the last few years, and maybe as part of that mention your involvement in the domestic advisory group as well, and how that's been a way for businesses to inform these talks?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think that there was a significant shift in terms of ministerial engagement in Brussels following the election of the Labour Party. I think they have had more ministers out here in the last almost 12 months than you could probably put together in the preceding 4 years. So I think there has been a huge political engagement from the government, as well as an incredible technical engagement of the negotiating teams, looking at various work streams to understand where this summit will land in terms of the priorities and that the two parties will bring forward. From a business perspective, there's been opportunities feeding into both sides, working with our European networks, ensuring that European business groups are feeding into the Commission, into their member states, who will influence this process. And as you said, Will, there's also the Domestic Advisory Group, which is a civil society group, so representing business groups, trade unions, and the third sector, including voluntary organisations, citizens groups. It's a fundamental part of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. It has a functional role in that as a consultation body to advise the UK on elements of the TCA. They will also be involved in the review process, whatever the shape that takes. So it has a formal role as well as an informal role in feeding in. Each side, the EU and the UK, have their own domestic advisory groups, or DAGs as they're known, and once a year they meet together, first in closed form between the two. So there's been a huge amount of work between the civil society groups, and the agenda is common. I think it's really important to say As we talked about right at the top of this, there is genuinely a appetite from European civil society groups, business groups, and others for progress on the UK-EU relationship, to use all of the different cooperation mechanisms which are available under the TCA to maximise that process. They also then meet with both sides in what's known as the Civil Society Forum. So there's been a huge amount of engagement, both at a political level, at a technical level, some informal and some formal. And I would think actually, I think David's made reference to this, that to some extent, that was the easy part of it. The harder part is going to actually be the work streams that potentially come out of this summit, and actually getting into the real technical negotiations of what the leaders have tasked their teams with exploring.
Just say quickly, sorry, David, did you want to add anything?
I was going to add, because to what's been happening. I mean, on the European Commission side, they started preparing for this ahead of the UK election. They were seeing that the UK was going to be putting things forward, and they were starting to respond, take soundings in Brussels from various people. And I guess this is a slight message to, on top of the domestic advisory groups, slight message to other businesses that the Commission had already started listing at that point. The UK government then started to get up and running. An awful lot of civil servants in different UK government departments were starting to get involved in a process. They have various ways that they are hooking into business and other asks. So lot of activity there. You've seen the European Parliament get involved. I spoke at a hearing there last month of their Trade and Foreign Affairs committees, but there's also the Parliamentary Assembly that met in March between MPs, peers, and members of the European Parliament. So there's actually a huge amount going on under the surface. And one of the interesting things is that although, particularly on the EU side, but even plenty on the UK side, try to underplay this relationship, the sheer amount of activity that's been going on at all points is really quite phenomenal. It's enough to keep us busy. There was a EU UK forum in February. There's a huge amount going on. There's a huge amount of touch points, and both sides, I think, are paying attention to what people say. This is, again, this is about finding that new relationship. Back in the days when Brexit was being negotiated, clearly that was quite an antagonistic space. We're now in a very different place where both sides have multiple people who are working on this, senior levels, political levels. There's working groups among technical officials on different issues, huge amounts going on. So, and I suppose that all adds up to about, even if not all of those issues are visible now. I mean, I was speaking to a friend who's been working on various parts of this picture a couple of weeks ago, and he was telling me about various conversations that are being had, various preparations. There's a huge amount going on.
Finally, just for this part of the conversation, I think you've both mentioned the review of the TCA, which I think is due for 2026. I was wondering, for those people on the call who may be less aware of what that is, Fergus, you just want to say what that review is, and it seems like another significant touch point, so it's probably worth us just explaining a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think the review is a much debated 2 lines of text in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. There's an Article 136, something like that. And look, the review is essentially a part of any trade agreement, part of any FTA. There are review clauses, and the review clause in the TCA says 5 years following the coming into force of the agreement, while the agreement was provisionally agreed at the end of 2020 and was provisionally applied in 2021. It didn't actually come into force until May of 2021. So you would say May 2026 is the deadline for that review to start taking place. Now, it's a review of the implementation of the TCA and other elements or words to that effect. And look, the reality of what the review will be and will not be is where the relationship is and where the politics between the two parties is. It can be as simple as a technical process to review the implementation where both sides agree these elements have been implemented well, these elements have not been implemented well, we'll go away and implement them. But it could be an opportunity to have a more broad overview of how the TCA is functioning. Is it fit for purpose in terms of the relationship which the two parties have committed to and continue to develop between now and then? So the scope is potentially wide, but it could also be very narrow. So I think it is important to put the review in context that is something which will technically need to take place next year. This summit is not a forerunner to that. It is a separate process. And let's see where we are in 12 months' time in terms of the appetite for either side to simply review or to potentially go further.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Fergus and David, for setting the scene already for the summit. We're going to have a quick look now at what you in the audience have been typing in so far. So thank you to everyone who has been writing in. First question we're going to have from Omar, who says, does the panel think that there may be a standardization of sustainability reporting, i.e. the UK aligning to EU reporting standards? David, I know you mentioned the ETS alignment earlier, so do you want to come in on that one?
I wrote a report in September last year in which I tried to make a list of all the issues that the UK and the EU would be discussing over the longer term. And I got lots of nice comments back saying that's a lovely report, and I'm sure it was just an omission that you failed to mention, and then they listed all the things that I'd failed to mention. This is a huge and sprawling report. So when it comes to something like the standardization of sustainability reporting, we don't know. I'll be bluntly honest. But one question that will come up with regard to linking of emissions trading schemes is just how broad is that defined? Is that defined to include broader EU Green Deal measures, in which case that could well include sustainability reporting, or not? And that's probably more likely to come out in the detail after the summit in terms of both sides seeking negotiating mandates, because the EU will need to seek a negotiating mandate from the European Council for these talks. And it will be, I think, at that point that member states will or will not say, actually, we should include something like standardization of sustainability reporting. Otherwise, and sorry to make this a very long answer, there will be a number of issues that will be not tackled in the summit, but need to be picked up down the line. And we're not quite sure what will happen with those. So that's a sort of bit of an open question as to what will happen. So not expecting anything major at the summit, may well follow on, or it may be in the back, a lot of issues that further discussions will need to be held on.
Watch this space. It seems to be the broad gist of that. If we can move on to the next question. So what about chemicals regulations? We might get a few of these sorts of questions. So is there much of a dialogue around chemicals at the moment? David, do you want to take that one as well?
Fergus was looking so keen to talk about chemicals, but chemicals is really, really complex. Because so we talk a lot about whether the UK should align to EU regulations, and if it aligned, whether it could get some kind of mutual recognition or some kind of market access benefit. You can't really align with REACH in a sense. You can sort of mirror it a little bit in some of the ways you work. You can share potentially technical information, but it's a subject all in its own right in terms of how you could work the UK and the EU could work together on it. Net effect. Now, this was mentioned, I think, back in July by Rachel Reeves, very freshly minted as Chancellor, even in the election campaign, possibly, as saying this is an area where the UK could look to align. And there were some eyebrows raised from the likes of myself thinking, well, not quite sure how you're going to do it. Some technical specialists have put forward some suggestions as to how this might happen. I don't think at this stage the UK government has taken those forward. But again, it's another of those issues. It doesn't go away. And because the UK is trying to put in place its own REACH system, and that's very expensive, there's definitely an incentive on the UK side to try to replicate or align in some way with the EU approach. But as yet, I don't think that's on the summit agenda.
Thank you, David. I hope that's useful. Elena, obviously a very thorny issue. But question from Katie. Given the EU's proposal for Northern Ireland to adopt the AI Act and Cyber Resilience Act, will there be further alignment on tech or compliance regulations? Fergus, do you want to take that one, a sort of tech and compliance area, but particularly with Northern Ireland?
Yeah, absolutely. A fantastic question from Katie, and a hello to Elena, who asked the previous question. Good to see you online. Look, I think that it is inevitable that as part of the discussions between the UK and the EU, that tech compliance regulation, AI, and other things are going to have to be part of the conversations going forward. The EU sees itself very much as leading some of the global regulatory discussions in terms of AI and tech and digital trade. So I can see that it would certainly be part of that. There have been some who've talked about and maybe manage expectations. I don't think that that level of detail is going to be discussed or even agreed at the summit. I think that there is going to be much more of a shape about how do we have and create and use the mechanisms of either the TCA or create new mechanisms to have these sort of dialogues on an ongoing basis. And I think that's the first thing. I think we have seen over the last 4 years of the TCA being in force, quite a lot of the T element of the TCA and less of the C element of the cooperation. And I think it's really important. This is an opportunity to turbocharge that cooperation, to have conversations like this. There's been some mention of whether the UK and the EU look at tech pacts similar to those that either the UK or the EU have with other trading partners. I think these are all important considerations. From a Northern Ireland perspective, just to pick it up very specifically on Northern Ireland, there is a different relationship in terms of European regulation going forward for Northern Ireland in comparison to GB from a UK, Great Britain from a UK perspective. So it is important to recognise those two things. David made reference to this in terms of veterinary agreements or SPS agreements. But there is a series of European regulations which were in force at the time of the withdrawal, and this is under the withdrawal agreement and the original Northern Ireland Protocol, and Annex 2 of that, which sets out the areas of regulation which Northern Ireland will continue to apply into the future, predominantly on the goods market, so the single market regulations for goods. The elements of ongoing legislative requirements are that historic set of regulations. In terms of new regulations which will apply in Northern Ireland, that will have to be part of a negotiation between the UK and the EU in any case. So regulation which isn't essentially an updated version of previous agreed scope of regulations under the original Northern Ireland Protocol have to be discussed between the two parties before they are applied. So in Northern Ireland's perspective in particular, there has to be a dialogue on this issue, and I anticipate it would make absolute sense for the UK and the EU to start a dialogue on tech regulation, tech compliance.
Thank you, Fergus. And thank you as well to Omar, Katie and Eleanor for the questions as well. We'll shortly move on to discussing the wider context of global trade in which this summit is taking place. But before we do, I just wanted to point out, for those of you navigating the new restrictions and rules that have come in post-Brexit for trading with the EU, the Chartered Institute is, of course, here to help. As you can see on screen, our Trading with the EU training course is ideal for businesses navigating new compliance requirements and complexities. This half-day course particularly focuses on new rules arising from the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement and the UK's border operating model. The course is ideal for both exporters and importers and is relevant to all levels of trade experience. So do definitely book onto that course and do so quickly because it does book up pretty fast as well. We don't do it kind of every day. It's on limited dates. So do have a look at that, book up quickly, and hopefully that will be useful for you as well. I'm sure a link will be posted in the comments. Right. As promised, we're now going to look into the summit within the broader context of what's going on in global trade, because if you haven't noticed, quite a lot is going on. So, Fergus, beginning with yourself, the UK has, at the same time as resetting its EU relationship, it's been negotiating this new trade deal with the US. A new deal was announced, a deal of sorts was announced last week, which sets out to reduce some of the tariffs that the Trump administration introduced for the UK earlier this year. What are the choices that the UK has faced and continues to face when it comes to the US and EU relationships? And can Starmer's government, as some say, have it both ways?
That's a fascinating question, and I think time will tell in terms of the strategy which has been deployed and how that will be deployed into the future. I think the two are not mutually exclusive. It isn't about having a good and functioning relationship with the US or a good and functioning relationship with the EU. But that said, there are some things which you agree with one party, which will impact what you can and not agree with others. Trade is not two-dimensional; it's three-dimensional. What you agree with one trading partner puts you in a different space in terms of what you can agree with another. But that said, having a good and functioning relationship with the US and the EU, as I said, is not mutually exclusive. And we've spent a long time having that debate that the UK needed to look elsewhere in terms of its growth of trade. Why doesn't it look at both improving the EU relationship and look at opportunities elsewhere in the world? And I think what you've seen in the last 2 weeks is a demonstration of that, and that it is possible. The UK has concluded certainly the framework of the FTA with India and the agreement last week with the US. So I think the EU will be keen to understand what those agreements entail. I think many of the questions that I've been asked have not been so much about the fact that the UK has concluded a deal already, concerned about it, but more what's actually in the deal. And I think that is recognizing the fact that the EU is keen to secure similar deals with India, similar deals with the US. So they want to understand what it is that the UK has achieved and potentially how they achieve that. So yes, they impact each other. No, they're not mutually exclusive. And I think both sides will be really interested in understanding what each side achieve with other trading partners. I think one interesting thing in the India agreement is the accumulation element, and that certainly has an impact on the UK-EU relationship, allowing for recognised EU content in that agreement as well. So some really interesting elements here, which show that the UK is thinking about this in more than a two-dimensional perspective.
David, this is something you've written about recently. You shared a link yesterday, I think, to an article you've done with Borderex, talking about how, particularly in connection to the India and US deals, the UK seems to be moving towards more of a pragmatic, incremental approach to its trade ties. So I've got kind of two questions for you. I mean, to what extent do the UK's other post-Brexit trade negotiations and deals affect or limit the UK in its future negotiations with the EU? And secondly, is there an acknowledgement behind what you describe as being the UK's move towards a more incremental trade policy that there are limitations?
Yes, very much so. So I think on the second part first, what I've said is that the UK, in concluding deals that are not the best possible deals you could ever imagine with India and the US, and indeed as will be with the EU, is showing a government that has perhaps moved beyond the kind of Brexit boosterism. The UK is going to be a leader in free trade. We're going to have great trade deals here, there, and everywhere. And it's kind of, I think, after a few months of testing that approach, new ministers have decided, you know what, that wasn't happening. It wasn't going to happen under any circumstances. Better that we just get some deals, start making some forward movements, just make a few things happen, give confidence to back to business that you've got a government that will try to do things, even if it can't do everything. So yes, that's reality. There are constraints on the UK. With regard to the India trade deal, plenty on tariff reduction, for example, not a lot on services. That's just a reality when the UK has a sensitivity on mobility coming from India, and the Indians have various sensitivities on services as well. In terms of then how these all affect the EU reset, well, there's a couple of trade negotiations still ongoing that actually should support the EU reset, which is the ones with Switzerland and with Turkey. Because the further you go with the EU, the further you should be able to go in trade agreements with the Swiss and with Turkey. Although the Turkey one is only just getting going. Clearly, you have, with the US, a little bit with Canada, some pressure on what the UK might do with the EU. But the UK government has been very clear that where there is such pressure, in terms of our trade relations, the EU one is the most important. And I don't think that's as much a value judgment as a volume judgment. That simply reflects the amount of trade that we have. And thus, if we're forced to choose, then it's going to be to choose the larger trade relationship. But as Fergus said, we'd rather not choose if we can avoid it. And we're also seeing today the Chinese government complaining a little bit to the UK about the UK-US deal and whether that affects the UK-China relationship. So all of these need to be considered by the government. I think they all are being considered by the government. But in terms of the EU reset, I think that the limitations on that are more set by the sort of long-term factors in the relationship, what happened, a certain amount of caution on both sides and the domestic politics on both sides, rather than other countries. I think that actually Trump is erratic, but there's not really a US concerted attempt to undermine the UK-EU reset.
Fergus, just to bring you in on that as well, because you were mentioning earlier about kind of three-dimensional, not two-dimensional, and I think quite often with trade deals and trade policy, it's a trap to fall into thinking about these things in isolation. As David says, there's migratory issues. You've mentioned defence earlier as well. I mean, to what extent are these other issues going to be impacting it's quite clear in some senses because of the defence security pact that's being announced. But could you just speak a bit to how important it is to kind of view trade and even economics within the context of all these other political policy issues?
Yeah, I think it's really important, and I remember being in a debate in the UK Parliament many years ago during the height of the negotiations with the UK, and speaking to someone who was saying that things like mobility, movement of people, visas, etc., they're not part of trade agreements. Other than the fact that mobility certainly is, that it's technically true to say that they aren't part of a free trade agreement as it's defined. But actually, the overall relationship between any trading partner is multifaceted. It is foreign policy. It is a variety of different areas. And they will all have priorities going into any negotiation, going into any discussion. And they're really vitally important to the interests of those two sides. It's fair to say that when it came to the final element of the UK-EU negotiations in the latter end of 2019 and certainly the early part of 2020, there was some surprise from the EU side that the UK had taken foreign policy cooperation off the table as part of the element of the wider relationship to be negotiated. So it's fair to say that while they may not be technically part of a free trade agreement, an FTA, they are vitally important. The surrounding relationship and strategic partnership which two trading partners develop, it's important because they are important issues to each side, but it's also important in building the trust which is required to sometimes in these sort of trading relationships to take leaps of faith which are required to improve the economic relationship.
Let's bring it back to trade, though. David, in your article, you mentioned about there being a lot of emphasis since Brexit on negotiating new trade deals, but actually there's a need to implement these and for businesses to utilise them, for them to actually have any effect. You also mentioned the upcoming trade strategy as having importance in this regard. So to what extent do you think we are entering a new phase of this sort of post-Brexit relationship where government's focus is actually more about implementation and utilisation than it is about negotiating new things?
Well, let's see. I mean, in some ways, of course, because we already have a UK-EU trade deal and we're trying to deepen it, this is a good example of the sorts of things that the UK government may want to look at more broadly in terms of trade strategy, now expected next month, I think, of saying, look, what can we do where we already have existing trade agreements? What can we do to deepen those trade agreements, to address the issues that businesses still have? Because trade agreements don't free all trade between companies in one country and another. They should make it easier, but there's still a lot left to do. So I think that UK ministers are attracted to this idea of greater focus on that. But obviously, trade deals are still set up by media and politicians as the kind of the thing you have to have to show that you're doing well. So I think there'll be an attempt to find a new balance and to do both those things. I don't think the UK government is going to sort of fully abandon the effort either to get new deals or to enhance old ones, but it will try to balance that a little bit more, I think, in favor of making sure the deals that are in place are well used and can be expanded potentially with countries where we can do more trade. For example, Japan, definitely, for example, Canada, where talks on a replacement agreement had stalled. South Korea, where there's talks ongoing. So I think there are a number of countries where we can see that coming into place, and the EU is absolutely at the heart of that trade strategy, I think.
Terrific. Thank you to David and Fergus. We'll move on to some more of your comments and questions from the audience shortly. But before we do, just a reminder of what I said at the top of the show, which is that this is the first of 2 events we're doing about the UK-EU summit. The second will be a session on the day after the summit. So that's going to be 20th of May for this second session. And here Fergus will be joined by Caroline Reid, the Deputy Ambassador in the UK mission to the EU, to digest the major announcements and outcomes from the summit. This is an event we're doing exclusively for our members. If you're not yet a member, you should sign up fast to get access to what is set to be a really insightful session. Members of the Chartered Institute also get access to a range of other benefits too, as well as these exclusive sessions we have with people like Caroline and Fergus. You can get access to our technical helpline to get expert advice on all your everyday customs and trade questions. You can avail of opportunities to network with like-minded professionals via industry events and sector-specific special interest groups. And you can get access to expert-produced resources, articles, and webinars on all things trade, and so much more. Links have already been posted in the chat, I believe, and that should be to both membership and to next week's event in the comments. So, right, let's get on to a few more of the audience's questions. So thank you everyone who's been writing in so far. The question from Blaze, does the UK rejoining the EU ETS mean higher fees for UK airlines paying for their CO2 emissions? David, do you want to take that one? It's a slightly interesting one.
It's interesting, and I must confess I don't actually know. I mean, certainly at the moment, ETS charges in the EU are higher than they are in the UK. So there are definitely some companies who are worrying about that. But on the other hand, that they'll be it'll be easier to trade in the future. So I'm afraid I'm having to pass though on how that directly affects airlines. But again, just another example of how many issues there are in this relationship and in modern trade in general.
Terrific. Thank you, David. Thank you, Blaze, for the question. I think we've got another question coming through. Yep, Stephen, will there be any discussion around reducing barriers to UK workers delivering services in the EU, i.e. visas or carnets? Fergus, do you want to come in on that one first?
Yeah, very happy to. And hi, Steve. Great question. I mean, I think we should recognise in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement that there is some really progressive elements of mobility for after-sales services of manufactured goods, but it's by no means a perfect solution. I know that the UK government have set mobility as one of their priorities. It was their priority under the manifesto. So I think that they are certainly seeing this as a priority going forward. And I know that there are European counterparts, particularly on this issue, who see it as a potential advantage. One of the challenges in terms of mobility in the UK-EU relationship is that much of the requirements are actually national member state requirements. So the competency doesn't naturally sit with the European Commission. So for the European Commission to take a position on that, they would have to work with the 27 member states to find a common position. That's one of the reasons why the mobility element of the TCA was quite surprising when it finally came to the final deal. So I think absolutely it's a priority. But I think it gets back to that point that David was making, and from Blaze's question around EU ETS. The statements of what either side would want to see, for example, EU ETS linkage, are simple things to say, but the it hides an enormous amount of complicated technical work which is required to understand the various implications of that. So, EU ETS linkage, does that mean linkage to the previous UK emissions trading scheme? Is it phase 4? Is it phase 5, which goes into a greater number of sectors? And I think these are all questions that technical negotiation, technical discussions, which I anticipate will follow this summit, will draw out. And that's one of the reasons why we think of this summit as the start of a process in many ways rather than the conclusion, because there will be a lot of complicated discussions which may take many years. And I think that the overall process here is not a year to year from one summit to the next. It is about establishing a number of work streams, some of which will be delivered quicker, but some of which may take a number of years to be delivered.
Thank you, Fergus. Thank you, Stephen, for the question. One last question from me before we wrap up. And we've talked a lot about the sort of the technical negotiations and some of the announcements and dialogues which we expect could be made on Monday next week. But one of the things which we've not talked about so much is, well, we have talked around it, but we haven't talked about it specifically, is there was a report in Politico, I think it was the end of the last month, that the UK and EU are going to declare or sign a shared commitment to open and free trade at the kind of highest level, almost at the philosophical level. How important, beginning with Fergus, how important is that mission statement almost from the UK and EU regarding free and open trade?
Look, I think in the current environment that we find ourselves in, it's vitally important. The trends that we have seen, and not least with the second Trump presidency, orthodoxy around the world was changing. You were starting to see increasing protectionism. You were starting to see shortening of supply chains, additional legislation looking at protecting critical materials and critical minerals in supply chains for national interests. So I think that declaration should not be underestimated. And I think that looking to the future, that commitment on open and free trade, on the rules-based system, on working with like-minded partners to achieve common goals in keeping trade flowing, I think is really important. It's important that you are setting the scene, not just for the trade in goods, but also the conversations around trade in services, digital trade, that there is a common understanding that the positions which the two parties will take on the global stage are aligned. So it isn't to be underestimated, and I certainly think I would welcome that if I saw those words in the final documents.
David, anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, what I would hope to see is not just some words, but it would be nice to even say, and we will have a dialogue between our respective trade teams to talk about how to take this forward. Those are the sorts of extra measures that I think will make a difference here. So we're talking about technical negotiations. We're going to have a summit declaration. We're going to go into technical negotiations in a number of areas. We've got some other areas to think about later on. What I think we need to see is to get this relationship. This relationship has been reset. I think that's been a success. What I'm now thinking about is how do we support it going forward? And I think the more dialogues there are around issues like supporting open trade, I think that will really help the relationship to develop from here.
Terrific. Thank you, David. We're starting to get towards the witching hour, as it were. So I'd like to thank Fergus and David again for today's discussion. And as we move on to the final slide, me and I've certainly come away much wiser about what the summit is going to be about, its significance for post-Brexit trade, and its potentially significance for broader international global trade as well. So thank you so much for your insights and clarity as well, David and Fergus, and also for humouring my various lines of questioning as well. But as noted earlier, this has been a more policy-based discussion rather than a session looking into practical compliance issues. If you do have any practical questions or compliance issues you'd like support on, do remember that business members of the Chartered Institute can access expert support at any time via our International Trade Technical Helpline. So whether that's questions on customs declarations or outward processing, rules of origin tariffs, or any of the other thrilling compliance topics which are out there in trade, the helpline is very much there to help give you peace of mind through access to our fantastic team of experts. Members can also register to our post-summit review event on Tuesday, 20th of May, where Fergus will be joined by Caroline Reid, the Deputy Ambassador in the UK mission to the EU. As said already, members can access a range of other benefits as well, and there are links in the comments to all of that. But that's enough of that. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Please do feel free to continue the conversation. The team will continue to be active in the comments and replying to your questions and thoughts where appropriate. We very much hope you enjoyed today's session, and we hope to see you again on another LinkedIn Live or webinar in the near future. But for now, goodbye.